So I'm going to talk about evolution and revolution today. And I like those two terms because they're rather dramatic. And how it sort of happened to me, and what changed and what didn't. So the Zen people say, in the beginning of your practice, there's the mountains and the trees and the river. And so at the beginning of my practice, which started in 1979, from 77 to 79, I was in a mild state of depression for 2 years. Not quite sure why. Everything was supposed to be really good. I had worked my way up from a part-time salesman to a manager of a retail store, which tended to do the most business. And in 76, I got the biggest bonus of all the other managers, which made me feel like really good. I had a new car, polyester shirt, nice hair, girlfriend, and cool shoes. And it was just like, it just wasn't going to get much better than that. And then for some reason, I went into this sort of state of depression, which I think was sort of a subconscious paradigm clash of the way things were supposed to be, the way things could be, and the way things are. And I didn't have a vocabulary or personal experience that would allow me to reconcile or resolve the issues. I wasn't smart enough. And that was okay, because ignorance is bliss. So in 1979, after 2 years of this sort of melancholy, I decided to investigate religion to see if that would add something positive to my lifestyle. So the book, World Religions, Houston Smith, the chapter Buddhism, I found my religion. So then I found a meditation center so I could practice my religion. And the evolution that occurred in the first couple years of my practice was a personal growth, a sort of personal maturity, if you will, finding out more about myself than I had ever thought was possible, because I was rather superficial, but happy and pleasantly superficial. I had been a Republican for a few years. I was a member of the NRA. I knew exactly how the world was supposed to be, as do most Republicans. And I was happy in my ignorance. And then the problem with evolving as a spiritual person is you start to question stuff. So I started to question stuff, and I don't know if I was ready for all the answers that were going to be coming. So I started to question why I was a Republican, and then I decided that I should probably be a Democrat, because after all, I was going to be a Buddhist. And then I decided maybe I should just be an independent and be in the middle, because the Buddha kept talking about the middle path and not committing yourself one way or the other. Then I reflected on the NRA, and I said to myself, well, they have some good points and they have some bad points, but I don't know if I need to be a member. And when I went to one of their conventions, I had sort of long hair, and I had blue jeans and a T-shirt that had something written on the front of it. And I was like the only one there that had that. And they went through all my bags to see if I was carrying weapons, and I'm thinking, this is the NRA. Why do they care if I'm carrying weapons, But so after that experience, I realized I really didn't fit in there either, so I stopped paying my dues. And then as I continued to evolve in my evolution, I'm going to call this the horizontal line. As I continued to evolve in my evolution, I started to question things around me that I had taken for granted my whole life. And the first big question was, is there a God? Now, being a Buddhist is not a big issue. You don't need to say there is or isn't. But I'd been brought up Lutheran. I had money in my wallet that said, "In God we trust." The Pledge of Allegiance talked about God. All these things. And I said, have I ever spoken to God? And I had to reflect on the fact that I had never spoken personally to God. Had I ever had a direct experience of God? And I had to say, I really never had a direct experience of God. So then I came to the conclusion that my whole relationship with God was an intellectual one, a conceptual one. And then I said to myself, what would happen now that I've given up being a Republican and a member of the NRA, what would happen if I decided not to believe in God? And this was a big decision on my part because, I had seen movies and read books that lightning will strike you dead or you'll go to hell forever. So in coming to the compromise of not believing in God, I said to myself, I'm going to not believe in God, and I'm not going to not believe there isn't a God. I'm going to sort of be non-committal and say God can take care of himself without me believing in him. If people believe in God, I will listen, and I will applaud and support. And if people don't believe in God, I will listen, and I will applaud and support. But maybe from this day forth, I'll just be into the place of, I don't know. So once I firmed all that up intellectually and decided that I don't know, this huge burden was lifted off my shoulders. I found that there was a sort of freedom in not having to believe or not having not to believe, of simply just not knowing. So then I continued to evolve and purge myself of useless concepts. And I said to myself, I wonder how it would feel to question America. Does America really exist? And if it does exist, what is it? And where does the heart or soul of America reside? And I can remember on a Memorial Day in Westwood Village, in that giant cemetery, they had all these American flags in front of each of the gravestones. And I can remember looking at them, and there were like hundreds, if not thousands of them. And I thought to myself, that's a concept, that American flag. It stands for America and the beginning and all the things we fought for and all the things we believe in and all the things that are good. And all those people died for that concept because they believed in it so much they were willing to give up their life for the concept. And it just sort of tripped me out. I just went into another place and go, wow, humans, when they really commit themselves to a concept, they can go all the way. And their life becomes less important, and the concept becomes more important. And my limited knowledge of Buddhism at that time led me to believe that Buddhism was just a concept that we'd use like a raft to get to the other shore, and then we'd even jettison the concept. We'd even let go of that because the concept was no longer useful. We had achieved our goal. So I said to myself, human, living on Earth, being in America, being an independent, and I went through all these ways of identifying myself. And I said to myself, do I need all that identity to validate who I am and what I'm doing? And so this question of who I was started to be really important. And there weren't any good answers. Now, I could talk to my mom and she would tell me who I was, a slacker who didn't take out the trash and make his bed. But that was just one of me. And then I could talk to my sisters and brothers and they would give me sort of the sibling answer. And then I could talk to friends and enemies and they would tell me who I am. And all these people were just sort of like, yes, this is who I think you are. But when it came to define who I thought I was, I lacked the vocabulary. Again, I was speechless, if you will. But my evolution continued in spite of all these non-answers. I just kept getting deeper and deeper, and my little limited universe kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. which started to include more and more things that I might not agree with or believe in or understand, but those tended to be part of my universe as well. And I had to come to a place of acceptance with those as being a natural phenomena, part of my life. But still, the revolution hadn't occurred yet. This was just the evolution, and as my teacher had said, once you start to meditate, your evolution speeds up dramatically. And it may never slow down. You may just continue to evolve at a rapid rate, whether you're ready to or not. For the last few days, I've been listening to Ram Dass, one of my favorite teachers, Richard Alpert. This is an audio book of his talks he gave in 1996, I believe, when he was 65. He's talking about aging and maturity. And he, before his stroke, was the best storyteller of any spiritual teacher and always used himself as an example. And was not always successful in what he was doing or trying to do. And so one of my favorite stories about evolution and revolution was when he was back in the early 70s up in the San Francisco area, and he was giving a talk. And his audience was pretty much comprised of 20 to 25-year-olds, rather hairy with white clothes. And he was sitting on his chair, and he was talking, and right in front row was this lady of about 70 who wore very professional lace-up shoes in black and a straw hat with fake fruit. And she was listening to Ram Dass talk about his psychedelic experiences, and for some reason, she kept nodding yes. Now, Ram Dass evaluated this woman as having never taken anything maybe stronger than sherry in her whole life, and yet somehow she understood the complexities of the evolution of consciousness as evolving through psychedelic use. So he decided to see if he could get her to nod no, and he kept talking about even more esoteric experiences that he had, and she was right there with him all the way. So at the end of his talks, he oftentimes would just hug people who lined up, and she got in line. And so it was her turn, and he looked at her and said, I have to know, did you follow what I had to say? Do you know what I was talking about? She said, yes, and you said it so well, thank you. And then he looked at her and said, but how do you know? How do you know all these things that I talked about? And she looked at him and said, I crochet. Which is like the perfect answer. That we can alter our consciousness in many ways. So she had evolved and become part of the revolution through her crocheting. So I started to see that I was evolving, and now because of my breath counting practice of 2 years, I was starting to have little transcendental experiences. And what I mean by that is I was starting to transcend ego on occasion and sort of leave it behind and come to the place of direct experience. And when you come to the place of direct experience, you've left the finger pointing, and now you're looking at the moon. And now you are the moon. And as soon as you say, my, well, everything collapses and you're just observing it again. But until you say my, you are actually involved in the process of existence in a very direct way. And I thought that was fascinating, but again, I lacked the vocabulary to talk about it. And so I would ask people what they experienced. And they would tell me, and it didn't make any sense at all. So again, I hadn't evolved enough to have any kind of intellect that could understand all this stuff. So I decided to go on a reading binge. And the beginning of my reading binge was to read about people who had gone on meditation retreats and read about their experiences, like journals or books. And at the time, this was the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s. At the time, there were quite a few books out of people writing and talking about their experiences. So I sort of vicariously experienced what they had experienced, but they were able to define it for me in a way that I could understand. So I sort of needed them to give me some ideas of how to look at my own experiences. And then I found out about commentary. And commentary is something that very well-read and educated men and women write when they read a sutra or a Buddhist text, and then they write about what they think it means. And so I hadn't really gone into too many of the original Buddhist texts because I couldn't understand what they were talking about, and the Zen stuff left me cold. It was just like a bunch of poetry that had no beginning and no end. So through the commentaries, I was able to get a handle on what the sutras were trying to tell me, what the Buddha was trying to say. Because again, I lacked this sort of educational component. I just wasn't smart enough to get it. Part of the evolutionary process of meditation, though, exercises our intuition. And our intuition is something we rarely use anymore because our intellect is so powerful and takes care of most of the work. But the intuition is our innate intelligence. It's the intelligence that we're born with and carry with us all the time. And if it's not exercised, it's hard to understand this stuff, because this stuff is both ultimate and relative at the same time, both intellectual and intuitive. And if you read a whole lot of books and never exercise your intuition, you're going to miss the point. If you only exercise your intuition and never read a lot of books, you won't be able to talk about it or understand it intellectually, but the experience will still be the same. So I found through my meditation practice, and I found through reading commentary and experiences that other people had had, that both my intuition and my intellect were starting to grow. And I was able to start to see clearly these strange concepts that were counter to everything I had done or understood to be true before meditation. So now we come to this evolutionary part where we have the paradigm clash, where you have the new information and you have the old information, and they are fighting each other. And who's going to win? Well, if you stop meditating and walk away, the old information is going to win. And you'll just be pretty much the same as you always were, except you'll have some new experiences to think about and maybe talk about. But if you decide to move forward, if you decide to head on into the uncharted territory you're about to enter, then all these new paradigms become useful and rather interesting. One point to keep in mind is that you will lose friends and family if you decide to leave and go off into the new future, because friends and family aren't going to go with you, and they're going to think you're a bit odd, and some of them may think you are now taken over by the devil. So they're going to want to do an intervention and an exorcism on you. And you'll say, no, everything just exists the same as it did before, except differently. But they won't get that either. And so I had either the courage or the insanity or the foolishness of saying, okay, I'm going to see where this leads me. Because this is really cool. I already sort of know how the other part works. You know, you work really hard, you get a bonus, you wear cool clothes, and it keeps you happy up to a point. But then you always come to the place where the happiness isn't there anymore. So I kept going, and now the revolution began, where I was questioning everything and wondering how I had ever believed all the stuff I had believed before. And one of the most insidious stories was one that I got when I was in grade school. And it was George Washington. And it was an example of telling the truth. He cut down the cherry tree, and they asked him, did you cut down the cherry tree? And he said, yes, I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree. And then I was reading that was a lie, that he never cut down the cherry tree. that they made it up to give an example of truth. And so this really started to bother me, because I'm going to be part of the revolution now. What is truth? I said to myself. Well, truth at a relative level turns out to be anything you want it to be. It's created by consensus. If enough people believe it to be true, it is true. That's why it's really important to pick where you're going to live, because if you live in certain states, their truth is different than in other states. Even small communities, their truth is different than in other communities. Religions have an issue with truth as well, because they all have the truth. But it's all different. And then it comes to your truth. And what is your truth? Is your truth what you've come to understand or what you've come to experience? I find what experience does, it gives you confidence. It gives you confidence in the fact that what seems to be true now may not be true later, but right now it seems to be true. So there was a video I just saw on Facebook of a guy in Hawaii who wants to be a mayor. And he was caught jaywalking by the police, and they had sort of a physical argument, and he tried to run away. And they tased him, and he flopped on the ground, and then they handcuffed him. And I'm thinking his truth is just a little messed up. That in the context of the police and him, there was some kind of truth that was not obvious to him. And after having been a police chaplain for 6 years, volunteer police chaplain, not on the payroll, I came to understand that everybody has their own special little truth of the way it's going to be, but sometimes it has to be overridden by the people in charge. For instance, if I get a ticket for speeding and I'm at the side of the road and the officer says, "Do you have a driver's license?" And I say, "Yes," and I show him driver's license, and he says, "Is this you?" Theoretically, I could say, "No, this is not me. This symbolizes who I used to be." But I don't know if that truth is going to get me very far. So sometimes we have to bow to the truth of others just to get along, just to create a little harmony, just not to freak them out. And so the revolution happens internally, and now you don't want to freak everybody out because you've come to this other place where you see clearly how absurd this life is, and yet how important it is at exactly the same time. The absurdity starts right at birth. We're born to die. What's the point? I don't know. We have 7 billion people. What's the point? In 100 years, they'll all be dead. Where are we going to put them? There'll be 15 billion then. Where are we going to put them? We're going to have to find another planet just as a graveyard. There's a lot of people dying. How can you take it too seriously? You work really hard, you amass a fortune, you have a wonderful lifestyle, you get Alzheimer's and can't remember it's yours. What's the point? So I started to see it this way, and that's how I recognized the revolution. I was going through this internal revolution of awareness, that I was starting to see things perhaps the way other people had seen them long, long ago. And now my job was to sort of integrate all this new information in a way that allowed me to seem normal. So that's when I started the ordination process. I thought to myself, here I have an opportunity to be ordained as a Buddhist monk in Los Angeles. How far out is that? And I will be given permission to be a bit odd because I'm a Buddhist monk. And they're not normal, or they would dress differently. And they wouldn't live. I've lived in the meditation center now for 21 years. Who would live in a meditation center for 21 years? Wouldn't you just eventually move out? Yes, most people do. I'm still there. It seems to still work for me. But I'm given permission to do that. Sometimes I'm vegetarian. People say, well, he's a monk. Sometimes I eat cheeseburgers. Well, he must be a southern monk. One of those Theravada guys, you know. And so you're sort of looking at this kind of stuff, and this allowed me to continue my journey, to continue the evolution and revolution of my life, to finally come to a place where the mountains and the trees and the river were form and concept. That there was form and there was a concept that I would apply to them, because there is no such thing as a mountain. If you talk to people who speak different languages, they'll give you different words for that same form. And then, at one point in my revolution, everything became emptiness. That nothing existed independently. Everything was interconnected and interdependent. Now, for me, this was a radical concept, because I had always felt separate. I had never been cursed with loneliness, though. I'm so lucky. I appreciate the fact that aloneness on occasion can occur. Not in Koreatown, but other parts of the world, you can actually walk around and not see anybody. How wonderful is that? So, I wondered if anybody had written about this experience of interconnectedness and interdependence. I call this enlightenment. And I found someone who had written a book about how all things are connected. And his name is Ken Wilber. And he is loved or hated depending on how you look at him. But he's the first guy that I was able to read who said, this is how all things are connected. And you have the vertical and horizontal, and you have quadrants, and things fit in here, and things fit there, and it's really complicated, and I don't fully understand it. But I'm assuming he does, and it's a wonderful model and paradigm of how all things are interconnected and interdependent. But in the direct experience of that, you have no intellectual model necessary. It's simply opening your heart to the fact that you and everything are connected. Not the same, not one. Those are Christians that say that. The Buddhists would say interconnected, interdependent, unity, community. Those are really important words, I think. Not uniformity. And so as I read Ken Wilber, trying to understand what he was talking about, understanding some of it, I started to get this intellectual model now that went along with some of my meditation experiences of the interconnection and interdependence. I continued to meditate, I continued to evolve, I continued to participate in the revolution of my consciousness. And all of a sudden, all those mountains and streams and trees that were empty became mountains and trees and streams again. That you end up where you start. It might have been Aldous Huxley who said, I finally came to the fact that I was a fool. And just before I died, I realized I had never gone any further than simply being a fool. Now, in between the first fool and the last fool, there was sort of a lot of evolution and revolution and understanding. But do we really change that dramatically as humans? If we have all these experiences, do we really start to take on different shapes and forms and mind states? Maybe mind states. Maybe we do all the same stuff we did before, but we do it in a different way, which may or may not be obvious to people who are observing us. Maybe what we've done in some remarkable way has changed the way we relate to everything. That we've created entirely new forms of relationship with all the things that are in our life. And so, as Ram Dass would talk about, he says he's still neurotic, but now he sort of greets them and invites them in to see how they're doing. And so he created a different relationship with his neuroses. I was able to create a different relationship with my mother by being her son again, and not being a rebel or a nonconformist or not liking what she did because she was the old way and I wanted the new way. It was just so comfortable to go back in and meet her expectations. But in order to meet her expectations, I had to be less of who I needed to be, which turned out to be maturity. Ram Dass talks about being somebody and then evolving into being nobody. So at the beginning of my life, it was really important for me to look and be and act and think a certain way, because that was my definition of being somebody. But as I aged and meditated and read books about alternative lifestyles and ways of viewing the world, it wasn't as important. It became less and less important. And what started to become more important was the process and the evolution of becoming nobody. That being nobody allows you to feel pretty comfortable in any situation you find yourself in. When you're somebody, you demand certain conditions to be comfortable. So this evolution and revolution is real, but it's an internal one. I don't know if it can apply to the world around us. The world around us is pretty much messed up and always will be and always has been. Somebody complained about the Buddhists as not being engaged in changing the world because they realized the world was ultimately going to die, as was everybody on the world. And I disagree completely with that. For me, a Buddhist is someone who doesn't change the world but changes the suffering in the world. And if people are hungry and homeless, then they address that. If there's a man starving and a man fasting, the Buddhist feeds the man who's starving. So far so good. The revolution continues. My mind state continues to evolve. I include more and more things. I see the absurdity of the world. I see the paradox of good and bad living side by side in the same event. And my response to that is simply to smile and go, how else could it be? And then I go get a cup of coffee.